I remember the sound of numbers falling before I remember the laughter, because numbers were always clearer to me than faces or voices. $10 first, said loudly and confidently, the way an auctioneer says a price when he still believes in it, when he expects a hand to rise simply because that is how auctions usually work, and when no one moved, not even out of politeness. I felt the air around the platform tighten, thicken, every eye sliding over me again, if the crowd needed to confirm what it already knew. Then $5, his voice lighter now, joking, trying to turn discomfort into entertainment. A few men laughing, because laughing was easier than admitting the moment had gone wrong, but still no bids, still nothing. Then $3, quieter, almost embarrassed, the humor draining away as the silence stretched to long enough for my chest to feel heavy, and I lowered my head further, not out of shame, but out of habit, because I had learned early that looking up only invited people to look harder, to search my face for reasons to reject me again. And without meaning to, I began counting the cracks in the wooden platform beneath my feet, thin lines intersecting thicker ones, irregular but patterned, the way my mind always worked when the world around me felt unstable. And by the time he said $1, his voice had gone flat, stripped of performance, stripped even of cruelty. Just a man who wanted the day to be over. $1 to erase the final embarrassment of the auction. And in that moment, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. I was no longer being mocked. I was being erased, reduced to a price so small it barely registered as real. And when a single hand rose from the back of the crowd, hesitant, almost apologetic, the relief in the auctioneer's voice cut deeper than the laughter ever had. His gavel came down fast, final, sold, and the sound echoed inside me longer than it echoed in the square. My name is Judith, and on that August day in Savannah, Georgia, in 1851, I was 19 years old and sold for $1, because no one could imagine that someone who looked like me could be worth more. The laughter followed me as I stepped down from the block, sharp and careless, bouncing off the heat and the dust. But I didn't look up. I never did, because I knew what they saw when they looked at me. The split lip that never healed, the nose flattened and pulled wrong, the scars from the kitchen fire that twisted the right side of my face and left my eye half closed. I had seen those expressions my entire life. The flicker of surprise, the longer stare, the reflexive recoil, the way eyes slid away as if ashamed of their own curiosity. And I learned to live just outside the center of vision, present but not acknowledged. The man who bought me didn't laugh. Josiah Calhoun stood there with his hat in his hands, thin, weathered, clothes patched and faded. Poor enough that $1 mattered to him. And when he looked at me, it wasn't with disgust or pity, just calculation. The same look I had seen on men examining broken tools they hoped might still work. He asked if I could work, his voice practical, and I said yes, shaping the word carefully around a mouth that never cooperated, the sound coming out wrong no matter how hard I tried. And he nodded as if that settled it, because for him it did. On the wagon ride to his farm, the other slaves shifted away from me without being told, inch by inch, bodies leaning subtly, creating space heavier than touch would have been. I didn't resent them. I understood the instinct. Even among people owned and sold, there were still hierarchies of comfort, and I had never belonged anywhere inside them. The farm itself was small, struggling, nothing like the plantation where I had been born, nothing like the grand houses I had cleaned without being seen. This place felt tight, constrained, the kind of land where mistakes lingered and debt stayed close. Mr. Calhoun laid out the rules plainly when we arrived. Fields from sunup to sundown, barn for sleeping, 2 meals a day, no trouble. Then he reminded me what I was worth. $1, less than the mule, less than the tools in his shed. And I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I understood something he didn't yet. Price and value were not the same thing. That first night in the barn, my body aching in familiar ways, hands raw, muscles burning, I didn't replay the auction in my head. Humiliation was old. It had nothing new to teach me. Instead, I replayed fragments I'd overheard on the ride. The way his voice tightened when he mentioned seed costs. The way he avoided talking about last season's harvest. Numbers had always come to me without effort, long before I had words for them. As a child in the big house where I had been born, assigned to scrubbing floors and washing walls, because no one wanted to look at my face for long, I listened, really listened. Two masters curse their account books, complain about money disappearing, about figures that refused to behave. I couldn't read the words, no one ever taught me. But numbers never needed words. They stood alone, clean and honest. They stayed where you put them. They revealed patterns if you let them. And I understood them the way some people understood music or weather. Instinctively, quietly, I never told anyone. There was no point. People who laughed at my face were not going to trust my mind. So I learned to survive by observation. On Calhoun's farm the work was brutal and simple. My hands blistered and reopened. My back screamed, but pain was predictable. While I worked, I watched. I watched him get cheated by merchants who sensed his desperation. Watched him overpay for seed. Watched him sell crops too early or too late. Watched small mistakes stack into something heavier. And I listened when he muttered to himself, frustration slipping through the cracks of his pride. I saw patterns forming the same way I always did, quietly, insistently, like lines emerging if you stepped back far enough. I said nothing, not because I was afraid, but because I understood timing. You don't offer answers to someone who still believes effort alone will save him. You wait until effort fails. That moment came 3 months later, on a cold evening when the harvest should have brought relief, but instead brought fury. I was passing his house on my way to the barn when I heard him shouting, furniture scraping, papers tearing, his voice thick with frustration, repeating the same thing again and again, that the numbers didn't add up, that the season should have made money. I stopped without thinking, my mind already moving, already pulling together fragments I had collected over weeks, prices, quantities, timings, losses, debts. I could see the leak clearly now, not just one mistake but many, layered, compounding, and my heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from the weight of a decision I had been postponing, because once spoken, knowledge cannot be taken back. I stood there longer than I should have, the cold seeping into my feet, listening to him curse figures that made perfect sense to me. Then I knocked, the sound small but deliberate, when he opened the door and saw me. Annoyance crossed his face first, habit more than intent, but it didn't last long because desperation was heavier. I told him I could help, told him I understood numbers, my words slow, careful, shaped badly, but honestly. He laughed, tired and bitter, asked if I could read, and I told him the truth, that I couldn't, but that I didn't need to, that if he spoke the figures out loud, I could find what was wrong. I watched pride wrestle with survival on his face, and survival won. He stepped aside and spread his books across the table, began reading, his voice uneven, numbers spilling into the room, and as they did, the chaos resolved itself in my head, clean and sharp, every error revealing itself, every wasteful habit lining up. And when I spoke, I didn't embellish, I didn't dramatize. I simply told him who was cheating him, where he was losing money, why his farm was bleeding dollars one quiet mistake at a time. I didn't feel triumph then, I felt clarity, the calm that comes when something finally makes sense after a long time of noise. And as his expression shifted from disbelief to something closer to fear and hope, I understood that the fall from $10 to $1 on that auction block had not been the end of my story. It had been the countdown. And this moment, standing in his doorway with numbers finally spoken aloud, was where it reached zero. I didn't sleep that night, not really, even after I returned to the barn and lay down on the rough boards with the others breathing softly around me, because my mind would not slow, the numbers he had read aloud still moving inside my head, rearranging themselves, confirming what I already knew. And for the first time since the auction, since that long fall from $10 to $1, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest, not hope exactly, but direction. a sense that the ground beneath me had finally stopped shifting. The next morning the work felt the same on my body, but different in my thoughts. Every step through the fields sharpened by awareness, because now I knew Mr. Calhoun knew too. Not everything, not yet, but enough to be unsettled, enough to look at me differently. I could feel it even when his back was turned, the way his movements slowed when I passed, the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, and that attention was almost as uncomfortable as being ignored, because it carried weight, expectation, risk. I understood that moment as well. When you show a man the truth of his situation, you also show him the limits of his control, and men do not always react kindly to that. For 2 days he said nothing to me beyond the necessary instructions, but I heard him arguing with merchants in town, his voice firmer now, armed with figures he had never questioned before. I heard him pacing late into the night again, though the anger had changed shape, less blind, more focused. And on the third evening, he called me into the house without raising his voice, asked me to sit at the table like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and began reading numbers again, slower this time, careful, listening when I interrupted, watching my face not for deformity but for reaction. And I realized then how dangerous knowledge could be, because once you let it into a room, it changes the balance inside it. He asked me how I knew, really knew, and I told him the only truth I had. That numbers stayed with me, that I could hear them once and they didn't leave, that patterns revealed themselves whether I wanted them to or not. He didn't smile, didn't praise me, but he leaned back in his chair and exhaled as if something heavy had finally been set down, and that silence told me more than words could have. Over the next weeks my work in the fields continued, but my nights were spent at that table, listening, calculating, correcting, watching his farm begin to behave differently under the weight of small changes, expenses trimmed, deals questioned, waste eliminated. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious to an outsider, but to me it was like watching a fever break, and with each correction, with each dollar saved or properly accounted for, I felt the distance between who I had been on that auction block and who I was becoming stretch wider. Not because my face had changed, it hadn't, but because my position had, and I was careful not to mistake usefulness for safety. I knew too well how quickly circumstances could turn, how easily a man could decide that what helped him today threatened him tomorrow. So I watched him as closely as he watched me, measured his moods, his silences, the way he spoke my name now without the flatness it once carried, and still I said nothing about myself. Nothing about freedom, nothing about value beyond the numbers he could see, because I understood leverage as clearly as I understood loss, and leverage is wasted if revealed too soon. The other slaves noticed the change before anyone spoke of it, the way I was called to the house at night, the way Mr. Calhoun no longer spoke of me as a mistake, but they did not ask questions, and I did not offer answers, because this was not a thing that could be shared yet. It was fragile, built on trust that could still collapse, and in quiet moments, when exhaustion finally dulled my thoughts, I would remember the auctioneer's voice counting down, the way each number had stripped something away, and I realized then that what I had lost on that platform was not dignity or worth, because those things had never been granted to me in the first place. What I had lost was invisibility, and that loss, painful as it had been, had placed me exactly where I needed to be, inside a man's desperation, inside the narrow space where survival and listening intersect, and I knew, with a certainty that did not frighten me, that this was no longer about proving anything, not to him, not to the world that had left. This was about negotiating the terms of my existence with the only language anyone had ever respected, numbers, and as I lay awake listening to the barns settle around me, I understood that the next step was inevitable, that sooner or later Mr. Calhoun would have to decide what to do with a slave who could see his life more clearly than he could himself. And when that moment came, I intended to be ready, because I had not survived being sold for $1 to stop halfway, and whatever came next, it would not be decided on an auction block. I understood before he said anything that the rules had shifted, because men only listen carefully when they believe they might lose something, and Mr. Calhoun had begun to listen the way a man listens when his livelihood is no longer theoretical. When numbers stop being marks on a page and start becoming threats or lifelines, he stopped reading his accounts at me like a chore and started reading them like a confession. Slower, precise, waiting to see if I would interrupt. And when I did, when I corrected him, he no longer bristled. He leaned forward instead, elbows on the table, eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but in concentration. And that posture told me everything, because pride bends differently than fear. Over the next weeks the changes compounded, small adjustments stacking into something visible, debts shrinking, supplies negotiated down, sales timed better, and each time a result appeared. Each time money that should have vanished stayed where it belonged. I felt the space around me change again. The farm itself felt tighter, sharper, like a machine finally aligned. And I knew the danger of that too, because usefulness invites dependency, and dependency invites control. Mr. Calhoun began asking questions that went beyond figures, not about my past, not about my scars, but about how I saw things, how I knew when a merchant was lying, how I judged risk without writing anything down. And I answered carefully, never mystifying, never exaggerating, because men fear what they cannot categorize, and I did not want to become a curiosity. I wanted to remain a tool, at least for now, but a tool with terms. One evening after supper, when the house was quiet and the barn lights were low, he set his ledger aside and said my name the way he had never said it before. Not flat, not dismissive, but deliberate. And he asked me what I wanted, not in the abstract, not kindly, but directly, as if the question itself were a calculation. And for a moment I said nothing, because I understood the weight of that question better than he did. A slave does not answer what she wants, unless she is prepared to defend the cost of wanting it. So I told him the truth, not all of it, but enough. I told him I wanted to earn my freedom. I did not plead. I did not argue morality. I did not speak of justice or cruelty. I spoke of value. I told him I would pay for it the only way I knew how, with results, with money saved and earned, with proof that could be counted, because freedom framed as sentiment could be denied. But freedom framed as profit had to be reckoned with. He did not answer immediately. He leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes on the ceiling, running his own numbers, weighing cost against benefit, and I could almost hear the calculations forming behind his eyes. How much I had already saved him, how much more I might save him, what it would mean to lose that advantage, and what it would mean to keep a slave who now understood leverage. Silence stretched, thick but not hostile, and when he finally spoke, he named a number that landed between us like a challenge. $500, more than any slave like me could ever hope to touch. A fortune disguised as fairness, and he was careful with his words. He said it was what he would have paid if he had known what I could do. He said it had to be real value, documented, not guesses, not projections, money that stayed in his pocket because of me. And I agreed without hesitation, not because it was easy, but because I had already run the numbers in my head, because I knew what my work was worth even if no one else did yet. From that moment on, the work changed shape. I was still a slave in law, but functionally I had become something else, a manager without title, a mind without ownership. And the farm responded quickly, waste eliminated, new income streams identified, small opportunities seized that he would have dismissed before. And with every improvement I kept count, not on paper, never on paper, but in my head, the ledger growing clearer with each day. Other farmers began to notice, first quietly, then openly. They asked him how he had turned things around, and I watched him hesitate when he answered, watched him struggle with the truth of admitting that his advantage wore my face. Sometimes, he said, it was discipline, sometimes timing, sometimes luck, but eventually desperation and curiosity overcame pride, and a few came asking for help, asking if I could look at their numbers too. And that was when the terms shifted again, because suddenly my value extended beyond his land, beyond his control, and he saw it, saw that what he possessed could not be contained forever, so he negotiated instead. He charged them. He brought me into rooms I had never been allowed to sit in, had them read their figures aloud to me, while they avoided my eyes, and I corrected them the same way I had corrected him, calmly, precisely, stripping confusion down to cause and effect, and each dollar earned that way went into my invisible account, the one I carried with me everywhere, my freedom tally growing steadily. The work was exhausting in a different way now, mental rather than physical, but I welcomed it, because fatigue could not touch what I was building. Nights blurred into calculations, mornings into negotiations, and for the first time in my life, time itself felt like an asset rather than a sentence. I was careful to remain unremarkable in my manner, never gloating, never pushing, because success invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites resistance. But privately I felt something solid forming beneath me, a foundation built not on permission, but on proof. And when I thought back to the auction, to the numbers falling one by one, I understood then that they had not been measures of worth, they had been obstacles, each one stripping away illusion, until only reality remained. And reality, for the first time, was on my side. I marked the days by outcomes rather than hours after that, because hours belonged to the fields and nights to the table. But outcomes were what moved me closer to the number that now governed everything, $500, and I learned quickly that progress was rarely dramatic. It came in small victories that only mattered if you understood accumulation. A better seed contract here, a corrected scale there, a delayed sale that caught a higher price. And each time Mr. Calhoun saw money remain where it should have vanished, I watched his posture change a little more, watched him stop thinking of me as a temporary solution and start thinking of me as a structural one, something built into the workings of his survival. That dependence frightened him even as it benefited him. And fear makes men either cruel or cautious. He chose caution, which told me I had judged him correctly. The consultations multiplied. Farmers came from miles away. Men who would not have spoken to me on the road sat at his table and read their figures aloud, voices tight with discomfort. And I listened without judgment, without ceremony, because numbers do not care who speaks them. And when I spoke back, correcting, pointing, exposing losses they had normalized, I felt the shift happen again and again, disbelief turning into alarm, alarm into relief, relief into grudging respect. And each time they paid Mr. Calhoun for my work. Each time he counted the coins and marked the gain. I counted too, silently, my internal ledger growing heavier. The work sharpened me, but it also isolated me. Because usefulness does not equal belonging, even now, even as I made men richer than they had been before, they still avoided my eyes, still lowered their voices when they spoke of me, still treated my presence as a necessity other than a welcome. And I accepted that without bitterness, because bitterness wastes energy, and I needed every ounce of mine focused forward. There were nights when exhaustion caught me unguarded, and I wondered if freedom would feel any different, if a paper could truly undo years of being measured and dismissed. But those thoughts never lasted long, because doubt is a luxury for people with options, and I was building mine deliberately. The number crept closer, 400, 420, 460, and Mr. Calhoun watched that approach with the same mixed expression he wore when storms gathered on the horizon, knowing something inevitable was coming and calculating what it would cost him. The night I crossed the threshold, when my work tipped the balance beyond the figure he had named, there was no celebration, no announcement, just a long silence at the table as he recalculated what he already knew, his fingers drumming once against the wood before he stood and poured 2 cups of whiskey, offered me one without thinking, then stopped, caught himself, and set it down anyway. Because habits die slowly, he did not apologize, but he did something rarer. He acknowledged me, said my name, and met my eyes without flinching, and told me I had done exactly what I promised, that the $500 was no longer a question of if, but when. And in that moment I felt something tighten behind my ribs, not joy, not fear, but gravity, the sense that everything I had endured was condensing into a single point, a decision that could not be reversed. He asked me what I planned to do once I was free, and I told him the truth I had been saving, that I would continue this work, that I would take other clients, that I would build something that could not be taken from me by whim or circumstance, and instead of anger, I saw calculation again, followed by something like acceptance, because he understood now that keeping me enslaved beyond that point would not increase his control. It would expose its limits. The papers were drawn up the next week, manumission documents written in careful script that I could not read, but did not need to, because I understood their value without seeing the words. When he handed them to me, his hands shook slightly, whether from age or consequence I could not say, and I held them longer than necessary, feeling their weight, aware that nothing about me had changed except my legal position. My face was the same, my voice still broken, the world still sharp, but the ground beneath my feet was finally mine to stand on. And as I stepped outside with those papers folded carefully against my chest, the air felt different, not because it was kinder, but because for the first time, my future was something I could negotiate rather than endure, and I knew without hesitation that whatever freedom would cost me next, I was ready to pay it. Freedom did not arrive with applause or relief the way people imagine it does. It arrived quietly, almost awkwardly, like a door opening into a room when no one had prepared a chair for me. Because once the papers were signed and I was no longer property, the world did not suddenly know what to do with me. And neither did I. I continued working with Mr. Calhoun because survival does not wait for reinvention, and because he understood my value even if others still could not bear to look at my face long enough to accept it. But now the dynamic had shifted again. I was no longer leverage or investment. I was a free woman negotiating terms, and that unsettled him in ways he did not always name. He paid me fairly, kept his word, but he also watched me more closely, as if waiting to see whether freedom would make me reckless or disloyal, and I made sure it did neither. I worked with the same precision, the same restraint, because trust once earned can still be lost, and I had no intention of becoming a lesson in regret outside his farm. However, the reaction was immediate and predictable. When I approached potential clients on my own, men who had heard rumors of the woman who could see numbers without ink, the doors closed before conversations could begin. Some were polite, offering excuses about timing or need. Others were blunt, laughing outright at the idea that someone who spoke as I did, who looked as I did, could possibly be trusted with money. And each rejection carried the same unspoken message. Usefulness under supervision was tolerable. Independence was not. I absorbed those responses the way I had absorbed so many others, without drama, without anger, because anger clouds judgment and I needed mine clear. Instead, I returned to the work I could still access, the clients Mr. Calhoun referred, the men desperate enough to ignore their discomfort for the promise of results. And I built my reputation quietly, one solved problem at a time, one corrected ledger after another, never advertising, never pushing, letting outcomes speak because they were the only language anyone respected. Months passed this way, my savings growing slowly, my confidence growing faster, and yet I could feel the ceiling above me, invisible but firm, the limit of what I could achieve through proximity other than authority. I needed a break. Not a gift, but a crisis large enough that desperation would outweigh prejudice. And that crisis came in the summer of 1854, though I did not know its name at first. Only that one afternoon Mr. Calhoun sent for me, with a sharpness in his voice I had not heard since the night I first knocked on his door. There was a man in his house, he said, a merchant, wealthy, angry, bleeding money and running out of patience. And when I entered the room I saw Harrison Whitfield for the first time, his clothes fine, his posture rigid, his expression already halfway to dismissal. As his eyes moved over my face, the recoil was immediate, practiced, and I recognized it instantly. He did not hide it, did not soften it. He simply turned back to Mr. Calhoun and asked if this was a joke. And for a moment I wondered if this was where the ceiling would finally come down. But Mr. Calhoun surprised me. He did not hedge, did not minimize me. He told Whitfield plainly that I had saved his farm, that I had earned my freedom with numbers, that if anyone could find where his shipping business was bleeding money, it was me. Whitfield laughed, sharp and dismissive. But desperation has a way of bending even the stiffest pride, and after a long pause, after another glance at me that lingered just long enough to register disbelief rather than disgust, he agreed to try, not because he trusted me, but because he trusted loss even less. The meeting lasted hours, longer than any before, because his operation was larger, more complex, layers of transactions, shipments, warehouses, contracts. And as he read his figures aloud, my mind filled with movement, goods flowing, money diverting, patterns emerging that made my pulse quicken, not from excitement, but from certainty. I had seen this shape before, the shape of systematic theft hidden inside plausible error. And when I finally spoke, when I told him that he was being robbed by his own warehouse manager, that the losses were not accidents but design, the room went very still. Whitfield's face changed slowly, skepticism giving way to something colder, more dangerous, because I was not guessing. I was precise. I named shipments, dates, discrepancies too consistent to ignore, and I watched the moment when doubt became inevitability. He did not thank me then, did not even acknowledge me. He left abruptly, carrying the weight of what I had given him, and I understood that this was the most dangerous point in any revelation. When truth has been spoken but not yet confirmed, because if I was wrong, I would not simply be dismissed, I would be erased. But I was not wrong. Days later the confirmation came. The manager confronted, the theft exposed, and when Whitfield returned, his manner toward me had changed entirely. The revulsion still there, unhidden, but now layered with something else, respect forced into place by outcome. He paid me more than I asked, told others about me without softening the truth of who I was, and for the first time since my freedom, I felt the ceiling crack, not shatter, but split just enough to let something through. As word spread, more clients came, still cautious, still uncomfortable, but willing, because results have gravity, and gravity pulls even the unwilling. And as I took on more work, as my fees rose to match the value delivered, I realized that the work itself was changing me, not in spirit, but in scale, because I was no longer simply surviving or negotiating freedom. I was building leverage independent of any one man's tolerance, and that realization carried its own weight, because independence invites enemies as quickly as it invites opportunity. And as I stood in my small rented room one night, counting figures that now belonged entirely to me, I understood that the next phase of my life would not be quieter or easier, but it would be mine, and that knowledge settled over me with the same clarity I had felt when numbers first began to make sense, solid, undeniable, and irreversible. The attention came faster than I expected after that, not loud, not public, but insistent, like a tide that does not announce itself yet keeps rising all the same. Merchants, landowners, men who spoke my name carefully, as if it might stain their mouths, all of them arriving through back doors or quiet introductions, none of them comfortable, all of them desperate. And desperation is a powerful equalizer, because it forces men to choose between pride and survival wins more often than they like to admit. I worked relentlessly, not because I feared losing momentum, but because I understood that opportunity narrows quickly for people like me, that the window would close the moment results slowed or rumor turned. So I stayed precise, consistent, predictable. Every consultation a matter of method rather than performance. I listened, I calculated, I spoke only what could be proven, and slowly, painfully, a reputation formed that had nothing to do with my face and everything to do with outcomes. Money returned where it had been leaking, debts exposed for what they were, thefts uncovered, inefficiencies corrected, and each success tightened the web around me, because success attracts both allies and resentment, and I felt both growing in equal measure. I raised my fees not out of greed, but necessity, because price filters intent, and I had learned early that those who undervalue your work are the first to question it when challenged. Some balked, some insulted me openly, but enough paid that my time became scarce, and scarcity changed the tone of every conversation. Suddenly men waited for me. Suddenly my schedule mattered. Suddenly my refusal carried weight. And that shift unsettled them more than my appearance ever had, because it inverted a hierarchy they had never expected to negotiate. I moved out of the room I'd been renting and into a small house in Savannah, modest, unremarkable, but mine, a place where I could lock the door and think without interruption. And there, in the quiet evenings, I began to consider what money could do beyond protection, beyond independence, because once survival is secured, purpose demands attention. The first time I bought another person's freedom, it was almost accidental. A woman I had seen at an auction, older, bent, unwanted, sold cheaply because no one believed she had years left to work. I paid the price without negotiation, freed her immediately, and watched confusion give way to disbelief on her face. And something shifted inside me then, because I recognized that moment. The moment when a future opens unexpectedly, and I knew I could not unsee it. From there the pattern repeated, quietly at first, one person, then another, always those no one wanted, the damaged, the elderly, the inconvenient, because I knew better than anyone how quickly society discards what it cannot profit from. Word spread, not loudly, but steadily, and it changed the way people spoke about me, some with admiration, others with suspicion, because generosity from someone like me disrupted narratives they depended on. I was not supposed to have excess, let alone agency over it. Resentment sharpened. Whispers followed me in rooms where I was invited only because my work was needed. Comments made behind hands, judgments wrapped in scripture and custom. And I learned to hear them without reacting, because reaction feeds opposition, and I had no intention of becoming a symbol when I could be a force. The irony was not lost on me, that the same people who recoiled at my presence entrusted me with their fortunes, that my mind moved freely where my body was still policed by perception. But I used that contradiction other than resisting it, because contradiction creates leverage, and leverage creates change. By the end of that year, I was no longer introduced as Calhoun's former slave or even as a curiosity. I was introduced as a solution, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes resentfully, but always with expectation. And expectation is power if you know how to hold it. I kept my life deliberately narrow. No social circles, no unnecessary exposure, because familiarity breeds dismissal, and I had worked too hard to be dismissed again. Instead I invested, quietly, strategically, property, small interests, opportunities others overlooked, because they did not yet fit the story of recovery or growth. And as my wealth expanded, so did the pressure, the unspoken question of how someone like me should behave, how visible I should be allowed to become. And I understood then that success had placed me in a different kind of danger, not physical, but structural, because I was no longer invisible, and invisibility, for all its cruelty, had once been a form of protection. I did not regret the trade, but I respected its cost. And as I prepared to move forward, to take on larger clients, to step further beyond the boundaries that had once contained me, I knew that the next phase would demand more than intelligence or discipline. It would demand strategy, because power, once acquired, must be defended, and I had no intention of allowing the world that sold me for $1 to decide the limits of what I could become. By the time the talk of war stopped, sounding like distant thunder, and began to feel like pressure in the air, I had learned to recognize another pattern, one that had nothing to do with ledgers or shipping manifests and everything to do with fear. My clients began asking questions that were not framed as questions at all, but as confessions. What should I do with my money? Where should I hide what I have? Should I sell now or wait? Should I move assets north? Should I buy more land or get rid of it before things change? And I listened the same way I always did, not to the emotion in their voices, but to the assumptions underneath, the belief that the world they knew would continue, if they positioned themselves correctly. And that belief was the flaw. Because systems do not bend forever, they break. I told them the truth as clearly as I could. That slavery was not sustainable, that a war built around it would not preserve it, that wealth tied entirely to ownership of people was fragile in ways they refused to acknowledge. Some dismissed me immediately, offended not just by my words, but by the fact that they were coming from me. Others listened in silence and followed my advice quietly, selling land, liquidating assets, moving money into northern banks through intermediaries, diversifying into ventures that did not depend on forced labor, and as always, the outcomes separated belief from denial. When the war came in 1861, it did not announce itself gently. It tore through Georgia like a reckoning. Prices collapsed, supply chains shattered. Men who had once spoken confidently about inevitability came to me pale and shaken, asking if it was too late, and often it was, not because they lacked resources, but because they had waited for permission from a world that no longer existed. I had prepared differently, not out of confidence but caution, because caution had kept me alive longer than confidence ever would. Most of my money was already elsewhere by the time the first shots were fired, invested in places that would not burn when fields went empty. And I watched from Savannah as familiar fortunes dissolved, plantations abandoned, businesses shuttered, families scattered. The same men who had once dismissed me now avoiding my gaze, not out of disgust but shame, because they knew I had warned them, and warning ignored is harder to forgive than ignorance. The war years were dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with battlefields. Suspicion was everywhere, loyalty questioned, alliances shifting, and my position was precarious. A free black woman with resources, influence, and knowledge of other men's finances. I learned to be invisible again when visibility became a liability, to move quietly, to help quietly, funneling money where it was needed without leaving a trail that could be followed back to me. I supported abolitionist efforts through layers of intermediaries, funded safe houses, paid for passage, did things that would have gotten me killed if my name had been attached to them. And I did not romanticize that work. It was not heroism. It was obligation, because I understood better than most what the stakes were. When the war ended and slavery collapsed under the weight of its own violence, the South did not rebuild so much as unravel. Land flooded the market. Businesses failed not because they lacked potential, but because they lacked structure. And I moved then with the same clarity I had always trusted, not opportunistically, but decisively, buying property others could no longer maintain, acquiring assets that would recover when the noise settled. And among those properties was the one place I had avoided thinking about for years, the plantation where I had been born, where my mother had lived and died enslaved, where I had first learned what it meant to be counted and dismissed. Whitmore Plantation. The name still tasted bitter when I said it. The family that had owned it was ruined by the war. The master dead, the sons gone, the widow desperate to sell. And when the opportunity presented itself, I did not hesitate, not because I wanted revenge, but because I understood transformation. I purchased it quietly, for a fraction of what it had once been worth. And when the papers were signed and the land was legally mine, the weight of that inversion settled slowly. The fields where I had labored without choice now belonging to me. The house where decisions had been made about my life now subject to my decisions. People asked me why I would want it, why I would claim a place that held so much pain. And I told them the truth, that I was not reclaiming the past, I was repurposing it. I walked the property alone before any changes were made, listening to the silence, remembering the sound of work bells and orders. And I felt no triumph there, only resolve, because land remembers what it has been used for, and if it was to carry anything forward, it would be something better. I began planning immediately, not as an act of symbolism, but necessity. Education was the lever everything else rested on. Ignorance had been the strongest chain I had known, stronger even than ownership, and I would not reproduce it out of sentimentality. I converted slave quarters into classrooms, ordered books, hired teachers who understood the cost of opportunity because they had lived without it, And when the Judith Freeman Academy opened its doors, there was no ceremony, no speeches, just children arriving unsure and curious, filling spaces that had never been meant for them. And in those moments I felt the long arc of my life align, not as destiny, but as consequence. Everything I had learned, every number memorized, every insult endured, every risk calculated, had led here, not to erase what had been done, but to answer it. And as the school grew, as more students arrived, as parents began to trust what they saw rather than what they had been told to expect, I understood that this was the most dangerous work I had ever undertaken, because education does not ask permission. It creates futures that cannot be easily controlled. And I knew that opposition would come, louder and more organized than before, but I also knew something else, that I had spent my entire life preparing for resistance, and whatever form it took next, I would meet it the same way I always had, by seeing clearly, acting deliberately, and refusing to be moved by anyone else's limits. Opposition arrived exactly as I expected it would, not as open violence at first, but as murmurs sharpened into warnings, former planters shaking their heads, ministers speaking softly of order and propriety, neighbors reminding me that educating colored children was dangerous, that teaching them to read and calculate would only invite unrest. And I listened without reacting, because outrage is often just fear looking for justification. The academy grew anyway, steadily, quietly, children arriving from miles away, some barefoot, some carrying nothing but curiosity. And I watched them learn the same way I had once listened, intensely, absorbing what the world had denied them, and every lesson taught was an act of defiance, whether we named it that way or not. The irony never escaped me that the same society, which had depended on my financial mind, now found my use of it unsettling when it no longer served their comfort. They had tolerated my success when it increased their wealth. They resisted it when it increased someone else's potential. And that resistance sharpened after the war as the South struggled to redefine itself, because Reconstruction unsettled old hierarchies without fully dismantling them, leaving power anxious and reactive. Men who had lost fortunes looked for someone to blame, and a black woman with money, land, and influence made an easy target. Rumors spread that I was manipulating markets, that I was destabilizing communities, that I was encouraging insolence through education, and I recognized a pattern immediately. When people cannot challenge outcomes, they attack intent. So I insulated the academy carefully, legally, financially, structurally, ensuring it could withstand pressure from any single source. I diversified its funding, established formal governance, and tied its existence to documented benefit rather than goodwill, because goodwill evaporates under stress. Proof does not. I continued consulting selectively, not because I needed the income, but because maintaining economic relevance preserved leverage, and leverage preserves safety. My clients changed during those years. Fewer former planters, more merchants, more northern investors looking southward for opportunity in the wreckage. And I navigated those relationships with the same discipline I always had. Never sentimental, never reckless, because the margin for error had narrowed. The academy became more than a school. It became a symbol, whether I wanted it to or not. And symbols attract both devotion and hostility. There were threats, anonymous and otherwise, warnings delivered indirectly, suggestions that I temper my ambitions, that I remain grateful rather than assertive, and I weighed each carefully, not dismissing them, not surrendering to them either, because fear acknowledged is manageable, fear denied is corrosive. I responded not with confrontation, but expansion, adding programs, increasing enrollment, training teachers who would replicate the model elsewhere, because decentralization is the strongest defense against eradication. When something exists in many places, it becomes harder to eliminate, and that philosophy guided everything I did. I also formalized my philanthropic work, creating structures that could outlive my personal involvement, endowments rather than donations, institutions rather than favors, because I had learned early that dependency, Even benevolent dependency creates fragility. Independence must be designed deliberately. As the years passed and the immediate chaos of war receded, the South began its uneasy reconstruction, and I found myself consulted again, not just on finances, but on strategy, on how to build systems where none remained, and I accepted those roles cautiously, aware that proximity to power always carries risk, but also opportunity. I never forgot the auction block, never forgot the numbers falling, because memory keeps ambition grounded. And as I watched children graduate from the academy and move into roles once unimaginable, teachers, clerks, business owners, community leaders, I understood that the work I had chosen would never be finished in my lifetime. And that was precisely the point. I was not building a monument to myself. I was building momentum, something that would continue moving long after my name became less important than the results attached to it. The opposition did not disappear. It adapted, but so did we, quietly, methodically. And by the time the academy reached its 5th year, with hundreds of students and growing influence, it had become too embedded to dismiss, too productive to ignore, and too visible to erase without consequence. And in that realization, I felt the same calm certainty had felt years earlier when numbers first aligned in my head. That this phase, like every other, had not been granted to me. It had been constructed, piece by piece, decision by decision, and whatever resistance lay ahead, it would be met not with defiance alone, but with the steady accumulation of proof that the future I was helping to shape was not only possible, it was already underway. By the time my hair began to grey and my hands no longer moved as quickly as they once had across a table full of figures, I understood that time had become the most valuable asset I managed, not because it was scarce, but because it clarified everything it touched. The noise fell away, urgency softened into precision, and I could finally see the full shape of what had been built, not as intention, but as consequence. The academy no longer felt like an experiment or even a project. It felt like infrastructure, something people relied on without questioning its permanence. Children arrived already knowing its name, parents spoke of it as a given, and teachers trained there began opening schools of their own in nearby towns, carrying the method forward without asking permission, and that quiet replication told me more than any praise ever could. My consulting work continued, but it had evolved as well. Fewer emergencies, more long-range planning, advising communities rather than individuals, helping freed families pool resources, establish businesses, acquire land collectively rather than risk losing it in isolation. The conversations were different now, not about survival alone, but about durability, and I found that work more demanding than anything I had done before, because it required patience rather than urgency, trust rather than authority, and I approached it the same way I had always approached numbers, breaking complexity down into manageable parts, teaching others how to see patterns rather than rely on me to see them for them. The foundation was formalized during those years, the Judith Freeman Foundation, named not out of vanity but clarity, because names anchor responsibility. It funded scholarships, teacher training, small business loans, and it did so with conditions that encouraged independence rather than gratitude. I had no interest in building loyalty to myself, only capacity in others. Journalists began to appear occasionally, curious about the contradiction they thought they had discovered. A woman once sold for $1, now managing assets larger than those of many men who had once dismissed her. They asked how it felt, what drove me, whether I carried anger or bitterness, and I answered carefully, not to protect them from discomfort, but to protect the truth from simplification. I told them that anger is reactive. It burns quickly and leaves nothing behind. That what sustained me had always been clarity, the understanding of systems, and how to move within them without being consumed. Some listened, some wrote what they wanted anyway, because narratives are often chosen before facts are gathered. But by then, it mattered less. The work spoke more convincingly than I ever could. Invitations followed, conferences, gatherings, requests to speak about education, economics, reconstruction, and I accepted selectively, aware that visibility could still provoke backlash, but also knowing that silence cedes space to those who fear progress. The speech in Atlanta remains clearest in my memory, not because of the audience or the names involved, but because it required me to stand openly before hundreds of people without the shield of work or calculation, to let my face be seen without apology, my voice heard without correction. And I remember the moments before I spoke, the familiar instinct to lower my gaze rising instinctively, and the deliberate decision to resist it. Because I had spent too many years accommodating other people's discomfort, I told my story plainly, without embellishment, not to inspire pity, but to establish possibility. And when the applause came, it felt less like approval and more like recognition, not of me, but of what had been proven. That worth had never belonged to appearance, that capacity reveals itself under pressure, and that opportunity, once introduced, multiplies itself beyond control. In the years that followed, my role shifted again, from builder to steward, ensuring continuity, mentoring those who would assume responsibility when I could no longer carry it alone. And that transition required a different discipline, restraint rather than action, trust rather than oversight, letting others make mistakes and learn from them. The same grace I had once needed extended outward, and as my health began to fail, quietly, gradually, I put my affairs in order with the same care I had applied to everything else. Endowments secured, property structured to fund education rather than accumulation, leadership appointed based on competence rather than loyalty, because legacies collapse when they are built on personality rather than principle. I did not fear death when it came closer, because I had already lived beyond the limits once set for me. I had been counted and dismissed and counted again, and in the end, what remained was not the number of dollars accumulated or properties owned, but the multiplication of opportunity, the quiet confidence of people who no longer asked whether they were allowed to exist in certain spaces. They simply did. And as I looked back over the long arc from that auction block in Savannah to the institutions now operating independently of my presence, I understood something I had sensed but never articulated, that justice is not a moment or a verdict. It is a process, slow, deliberate, built from thousands of small decisions made consistently over time, and I had been fortunate, if that word still applied, to participate in that process not as a symbol, but as a practitioner, someone who learned early that numbers do not lie, but people often do, and that the surest way to change a system is not to shout at it, but to outgrow it, leaving it no choice but to adapt or become irrelevant, and whatever history chose to remember about me. I knew this much with certainty, that the girl sold for $1 had not simply survived, she had recalculated the terms of her existence, and in doing so, altered the equations that followed. The final years moved more quietly than the ones before them, not because there was less to do, but because the work no longer required my constant presence. Systems had replaced urgency, people had replaced necessity, and that was how I knew it would endure. I spent more time observing than directing, listening rather than correcting, watching former students teach their own children, watching businesses operate without my intervention, watching the academy function as if it had always existed, which was the highest measure of success I could imagine. When illness began to slow me, subtly at first, then unmistakably, I treated it the way I treated everything else, as information rather than injustice. I adjusted, delegated, conserved energy for decisions that still mattered. I dictated letters, finalized structures, ensured that nothing essential depended solely on my judgment, because dependence, even on good intentions, is fragile. Visitors came more frequently then, some seeking guidance, some seeking closure, some simply wanting to see if the stories were true, and I received them without resentment, because curiosity, however late, is still movement. I answered questions when they were sincere and let silence stand when they were not. The academy continued to grow even as I stepped back, its graduates spreading outward into places I would never see, carrying with them not my name, but the habits of thought that had sustained me. Attention to structure, patience with complexity, refusal to accept limits that were not grounded in reality. I took particular satisfaction in watching others handle money without fear, not worshipping it, not rejecting it, but using it deliberately, because fear distorts judgment as much as greed does, and I had lived long enough to see both destroy promising beginnings. The foundation was the last thing I put in order, expanded carefully so that it could operate without my supervision, governed by principles rather than personalities, focused on education, enterprise, and resilience, because those were the levers that had changed my life and would change others. When death finally approached in earnest, it did not feel dramatic. It felt administrative, another transition requiring preparation. I requested no ceremony, no embellishment, because I had spent my life stripping excess away to reach what mattered. I thought often of my mother then, of what she had never been allowed to imagine, and I wished, not for the first time, that she could have seen what grew from entrance rather than permission. My funeral, I was told later, was larger than expected, attended by people from many places and backgrounds. Some I had helped directly, others indirectly, all connected by outcomes rather than sentiment. And when Frederick Douglass spoke, when he said that I had been sold for $1 and proven priceless, I understood the weight of that contrast better than anyone listening, because I knew how easily it could have gone another way, how close invisibility had come to permanence. History has a way of simplifying lives into symbols, but symbols are incomplete. They erase the labor that makes survival possible. If my story endures, I hope it is not because of its improbability, but because of its method, because it demonstrates that power can be accumulated without cruelty, that intelligence does not require permission, that systems can be entered, understood, and reshaped from within. I was not exceptional because I succeeded. I succeeded because I learned to see clearly, to wait when waiting mattered, to act when action became unavoidable, to treat every limitation as a parameter rather than a verdict. I did not defeat the world that sold me for $1. I outgrew it, and in doing so, I made room for others to grow as well. That is the only legacy worth claiming, not the wealth accumulated, not the titles bestowed, but the quiet multiplication of possibility, the knowledge that when one life recalculates its worth accurately, the equation of many others changes with it. And if there is a final truth I leave behind, it is this, that value is never assigned honestly at the moment of sale. It reveals itself only through use, through persistence, through the refusal to accept any price that does not reflect what you can actually become.